And that's why these good ideas that colleagues from the hosting institution has had, the Community Jameel and just ideas of science, I like your ideas to come in, because we need to lead on the intellectual, technical capacity of societies to design this future will be, of course, different in every time. It has to be democratic, and I'm thinking about the long-term discussions that has taken place in South Africa to design the plan, the investment plan for Africa for the low carbon. For example, climate change science has been dominated by knowledge produced elsewhere, which has seen a mismatch with the actual problems, and in particular look at the significant social anthropological lesson emerging from the continent, for example, on clean cooking. There is a difference from government. OECD public finance, for example, is ignored by the citizen because they don't see where the money is going. And then there is, of course, a problem of control of parliaments, a local control, which is not always happening. So African continent needs to build its own framework to take the lead now on research and data production on the economic and socio-political effect of climate change. We have done many examples, but we need to invest in the intellectual. And we are, and I want not to be too long, we are at a moment where it's a crucial moment, I said, because of course of what we see on the ossification, I name that, so the Paris Agreement, we look at the procedures, we don't look at the substance. And then we are now coming into the new phase where we will have the global stocktake in very few days now. And then we have to design what are the solutions after. And what are the solutions is really having a new determined contributions that are really, not a paper on a shelf, not something that has not been debated by society, supported by the intellectual community, the science in countries. And it has to embark with local authorities and with business and investors. It cannot be something, again, a niche in the government. So this moment, and I hope this message from the Africa Summit would be really that this new round is a round where these countries, these regions, these countries can really propose their own vision based on sufficiently precise signal. And that NDCs are investment plan. They are democratically elaborated investment plan. And I like, again, President Ruto mentioned about democracy into what this future is like. So de-risking is about de-risking the climate transformation into the society and generating hope. That's why science is important. That's why democracy is important. And that's why ownership and leadership now from the countries more affected, and that can bring the solution. We really recognize the leadership of Kenya, which using this summit to launch the clear investment vehicles to attract investors and of course to build a new technical capacity to follow. National Green Development Bank or equivalent, I think there is mushrooming of ideas and proposal, and I think good to see that we have to embark with that and support that capacity of new leadership we absolutely, definitely need at global level. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you also to my co-hosts, Professor Tubiana, from whom you've just heard, and His Excellency Dr. Mahmoud. And thank you also, I wanted to particularly thank the Kenyan Special Climate Envoy, His Excellency Ali Mohammed. We raised the question or the issue, the topic of investing in science, innovation, entrepreneurship, and evidence-based policymaking early in the process for this summit. And it was tremendous to hear His Excellency, the President, Dr. Ruto, include that in his remarks this morning. And we look forward to seeing it also reflected in the declaration later this week. We believe at Community Jameel, I think many of us here gathered share the belief, that science is key to tackling the threats posed by climate change, from green technologies spun out in new companies to evidence-based climate policies. There are great opportunities, but they need funding to achieve impact at scale. In other words, they need climate finance. But there cannot be a just and equitable framework for climate finance without investment in science and innovation beyond the usual suspects in North America, Europe, and so on. In climate finance gatherings, we often hear the refrain that there's a shortage of investable opportunities. Maybe we're not looking hard enough, but we're certainly not investing enough beyond those usual suspect geographies. We need to invest in science and innovation because they together form the spring from which these investable opportunities will flow. In Africa, there are 100 researchers per million people, which is about 10 times fewer than in other geographies around the world. Nor is it simply a question of justice and equity. In fact, when we overlook investing in outside Europe and North America at scale, it's foolish because we overlook a huge pool of talent with the potential to have a dramatic impact in how we fight climate change. Talented scientists and researchers, talented inventors and entrepreneurs, talented civil servants advancing an approach to evidence-based policymaking. Without them, we are fighting climate change and its impact with one arm bound behind our backs. At Community Jameel, I'm sure that there's plenty more that we can do to address these inequities, but we are excited that this week we have launched a network of embedded climate labs in governments at the national, state, and city level in Africa and South Asia with colleagues from the Abdulatif Jameel Poverty Action Lab at MIT and C40. And I acknowledge here colleagues from Bloomberg and SIF, who are of course key partners in C40. And you'll hear more about that later from Teresa from JPAL, but also that here in Nairobi, Community Jameel has partnered with the International Livestock Research Institute, the University of Edinburgh, and others to launch the Jameel Observatory, which leverages not only data to model and forecast the effects of hunger and famine posed by climate change on food systems, but also traditional knowledge. And I think that's another point that I take from President Ruto's message this morning, that we cannot ignore the importance of traditional knowledge in this struggle. So I very much look forward to hearing from the panel, and thank you again for joining us here today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those opening remarks. I'd like to move now to the panel. And first, His Excellency Neil Wiegand, the British High Commissioner to the Republic of Kenya. Your Excellency, you were recently appointed British High Commissioner to the Republic of Kenya. In your opinion, how can governments help ensure more financing is being sent to build local scientific capacity and develop a framework for evidence-informed policy in low and middle-income countries?
Hi, can you hear me? So thank you very much. So it's a question I'm really interested in. As you said, I'm newly arrived in Kenya because I spent the last 4 years in Israel, which, if anyone who's been there, is a deeply unpromising country in many ways as an agricultural nation. It's over 50% desert, it has massive water shortage, very limited amount of land, and sort of whole host, and is in a region very heavily affected by climate change. And yet Israel is a very significant agriculture exporter, including to countries like the UK. It's a big exporter of agricultural technology, including here in Africa. And it's developed a very strong climate tech sector with over 500 startups active in that sector, which are generating billions of dollars of investment, hundreds of millions of dollars of exports, and thousands of jobs. And so when I came to Kenya, I was really struck by finding a great, and in Israel, that's been very much led by a depth of scientific research, specialist institutions and general universities, which put a huge amount of effort into basic research. And Israel spends about 5% of GDP a year on research and development. And that hasn't really been driven by the government. It's been driven by a tradition of scientific excellence with an enabling environment supported by the government. And coming to Kenya, I was very struck by similarities. So you have the same very wide range of geographies, of microclimates, and the opportunities that brings. You have some internationally renowned research institutes with very deep traditions of international cooperation, including in the UK. And you have a clearly very growing and vibrant tech sector. So it feels to me that a lot of the potential that I see in countries like Kenya is very acute. And I think there are 4 things that a government like mine, like the UK, can do to support that. So the first area is around financing, clearly, where the UK government has committed to providing almost £12 billion worth of climate finance. That's about $15 billion, depending on the exchange rate at any one time, to help support mitigation and adaptation, but with a very strong emphasis on evidence, on research, and on building local systems which can develop their capability to tackle climate change. The second area is around international cooperation in science and innovation. And a good example of this was after the COP26 summit in Glasgow, we launched the Global Partnership to Net Zero to develop methodologies to bring together scientific research and citizens' engagement to tackle climate policy challenges together. And here, as I talked about before, we see a huge opportunity around climate-smart agriculture, which could show huge both climate change benefits, but also great economic benefits to countries like Kenya. Thirdly, support for research and development that includes cross-border cooperation. So in the UK, we are raising our own research and development efforts to around £20 billion annually, but we're investing heavily in international cooperation. So for example, you talked about evidence in the question. So we have set up an evidence fund which supports the generation of context-specific evidence for development in East, West, and Southern African countries. And finally, of course, we need to invest heavily in developing research systems of the kind that I talked about here in Kenya. So here we have set up a £20 million Strengthening Research Institutions in Africa scheme, which enables to build research capability, to support the recruitment and retention of high-quality researchers, and to encourage more balanced and equal partnerships between northern and southern researchers to address the kind of equity that you talked about. So I think this is a really important topic. I think it's really important that this summit focused on African leadership and partnership on this important debate, that you've put the importance of science, innovation, and research and development really at front and center of how Africa will respond to those challenges and work internationally. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Moving to Kate Hampton, the CEO of the Children's Investment Fund Foundation. Kate, as CEO of CIF, one of the world's largest philanthropies tackling climate change, this year you've been involved as an advisor on the Paris Summit, the Africa Climate Summit, and the upcoming COP28. 3 critical moments in a critical year for efforts to secure a more just and equitable climate finance system. What has been the high point, and what more needs to be done?
Well, I have to say the Africa Climate Summit is the high point in its uniqueness because we haven't had one before. And I, like many others, have been very inspired by President Ruto's reframing of the issues and challenge to the world, actually, to see Africa in a completely different way. Without in any way diminishing the huge moral responsibility that the rich world has to meet its commitments. And we are in a situation of huge immorality with the debt crisis spiraling out of control. The crisis that many countries face are largely exogenous shocks. It's not macroeconomic mismanagement. It's COVID, it's the war in Ukraine and the cost of living crisis, it's climate, the increase in interest rates following quantitative easing. All of those things have contributed to this debt crisis, and so we all have a moral responsibility to address it. So I think it's really important to put that front and center, but I think it's also really important to put the opportunities front and center. I just want to underscore a point that Laurence made. I just want to emphasize it. the connection between public ownership and de-risking in finance may not be obvious to anyone, but let me give you a very clear example. In the early days of the development of renewable energy, when subsidies were required in Europe, because in Spain and Germany and many other places, that's what brought the cost down initially before China took over in terms of renewables. Every time there was a policy change, the cost of capital goes up. And those policy changes are due to shifts in politics, around polarization, about retreats from policy, about hesitation. And so there is a direct correlation between public ownership, political ownership across multiple parties and sections of the community, multi-level engagement, and access to markets and the level of confidence that investors have. And so public ownership is not just an absolute necessity from a political standpoint, it's an absolute necessity from a financial standpoint. And I just wanted to underscore that. And I think having a whole of society, whole of Africa conversation here will fundamentally change the way that people view investment opportunities in Africa, because they will see a coming together of governments, of private sector, civil society, institutional investors, indigenous peoples, all saying, you know, we want to be on this green train, and we need to come together, and here are the conditions for our participation. And I want to just go into the conditions for participation just very briefly, because I know there are a lot of speakers. I think we need action at every level, and this is the complexity. So it is clear that with the Bridgetown agenda and the Accra-Marrakesh agenda of the V20, very clear asks have been put on the table of the multilateral system, which is no longer fit for purpose. It was designed 80 years ago when many of the countries present here weren't independent. It needs a fundamental change. It needs a change in governance. It needs a change in the way the instruments work, in everything. A key goal, a key metric is going to be bringing down the cost of capital, particularly for Africa. It is unacceptable that Africa is paying many multiples for green investment than other parts of the world that have similar macroeconomic levels of stability and have much higher levels actually of debt on their balance sheets than Africa. And we are now seeing a massive wealth transfer from Africa to Wall Street because a lot of the debt is in the private sector and the interest rates got jacked up by the central banks of the global north. So we have to confront those issues and we have to reform the multilateral system. None of that is going to be quick. But in order for the system to stop working only for the creditors, it has to have a shift in the way that Africa and other parts of the developing world enter the conversation. And this is what I find so exciting about the Africa Climate Summit. There is a real potential here to start rethinking the international financial system, rethinking financial markets, rethinking how debt markets work, that give agency to the countries that need the investments, that have the huge assets. We heard it from President Ruto today. Youth, natural capital, huge potential for value addition around the export of critical minerals, moving from a commodity exporter to an industrial hub. Huge opportunities, but that requires us to rethink, and that requires a different kind of engagement. But you know, I agree with Laurence and many others that that's going to require a huge amount of ambition, agency, and coordination by Africa, including huge investments in science and technology to move up the value addition chain to get that 7 trillion share of the green growth markets that were highlighted this morning. So huge investment. A lot of that is going to have to be motivated domestically, locally. But I think if that happens, it will change the global conversation in a very fundamental way. And that is why so many people have shown up, and we've had like, you know, registration and accreditation has been overwhelmed because I'm not sure people realize quite how much international interest there would be. And so it shows just how powerful it is when Africa comes together and says something different and challenging and disruptive. And there are many, many, many allies around the world that want to be part of that growth story. So that's why I think Africa Climate Summit is the most exciting.
Thank you so much, Kate. I understand you might have to leave us a little early, so
a meeting with the Kenyan government, and they're our hosts, so they take priority.
Thank you. Moving on to the African Development Bank, Mr. Anthony Okonyong, the Director of Climate Change and Green Growth at the African Development Bank. So the bank is taking a lead on the continent to tackle climate change. Do you think multilateral development banks need to invest more in local science and research in low and middle income countries? And what impact would this have on MDB lending practices?
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me thank the organizers for inviting us to this very important meeting. And I think it's appropriate. Let me start by stating first, I really don't understand what local science is. I could start from there because it means once there's local science, there's also international science. And then the same narrative, Africans are in the local science space. So I think I would want to object to that. But importantly, let me just tell a clear story why we do the things we do. 2007 IPCC Fourth Assessment Report. 97% of the authors in the Africa chapter was from outside of Africa. 3% came from Africa. 90% of the 3% came from South Africa. Then you could see where it was. This is where the science is being done and reported. This is where the narrative is being set. It is that narrative that puts Africa as the most vulnerable, the least able to help itself, and all the risk and hazards and everything you can imagine is slammed on the African continent. And the list just trickles down. What does it do? It leads to what gets us to the debt, because nobody understands that risk. It's so risky. It's so this. We slam premiums on African projects. The cost of capital goes up. And the spiral just continues and then leads to the debts you're talking about and so on. So we've looked at it at the African Development Bank and said, no, this is not helping. How do we work with local institutions to design our projects? And there are benefits in doing that. That local institutions, they understand this better. You build local capacity. They sustain your projects. If not, we see what has always been done. We've seen so many failed projects on the African continent because people never looked at those local communities. My grandmother doesn't know what adaptation and mitigation are. We make these things up. She understands good agricultural practice. She understands the things they need to do. So sometimes we bring these things and further confuse people. So going back to where I was coming from, that this, we work with local communities, local institutions to do risk assessments for us. And we understand how these things are. We had a project we had to do in Ghana. We first of all had to do a review of the gender dimensions of infrastructure development in that country. And we found that while they did so well on express roads, on highways, they never considered the footpaths. This is where the women used to go to the hospitals, to go to the markets, to go to everywhere. So you could actually tell that these women were cut off completely from access to hospitals, access to markets, access to schools, because nobody looked at those footpaths to modernize them and so on. So and how did we get to know this? Because we talked with the local people. So this is very important for us as a bank. And so we've decided that all our projects, it must be based on knowledge, on science that we can trust, that we know. That way we will avoid maladaptation. That's where we will see that things work well. In conclusion, many years ago, I used to work in this city. And we noticed that ICPAC, the IGAD Climate Prediction and Analysis Center, the best on the African continent in terms of regional downscaling. But each time there was the planting season, the local farmers went to the traditional forecasters, and we couldn't understand. I was able to raise resources and brought those traditional forecasters and brought the heavy-duty scientists from ICPAC, put them in one room, told themselves, shut the door. When you come out with a solution, why do these local farmers go to the traditional forecasters? What is it they know that you don't know? It's spawned into a multi-million-dollar project eventually, because it also increased the usage and the adoption of those scientific indices and scientific data that we had. Why? Because we brought together those traditional forecasters and the scientists, and they came together and strengthened each other. And that's why ICPAC is doing very well today. So I think it is important that MDBs, you're doing development is local. Get into that space and work with the local population. And thank you.
Thank you. Great point around local science. I think in when we speak about local science, and I think Dr. Guya and Dr. Apollinaire will speak a little bit more about this. It's around investing in local scientists and research. Moving on to the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, Giampero Nasci, the Director of Climate Strategy and Delivery Department at EBRD. So looking and focusing more on the private sector, what tools and approaches can be used to scale up climate finance through private channels and increase private sector mobilization?
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here and an honor to be in this distinguished panel. Let me just do a very brief introduction about the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. So we are a multilateral development bank. We operate in a broad region that goes from Morocco to Mongolia, from the Baltics to Egypt, and we are focused on the private sector. So our mandate is to develop local markets, to promote sustainable development through the private sector. Every year we finance around 12 billion euro across 400 projects, and 3/4 of what we do is indeed through private channel. We are relatively new in Africa. We've been working for over 10 years in North Africa, in Morocco, Tunisia, and Egypt, and we are now about to start operation in 6 additional countries: Kenya, Ghana, Nigeria, Cote d'Ivoire, Benin, and Senegal. So coming back to your question, clearly the role of the private sector, the private capital, is central in scaling up the provision of climate finance and providing the possibility to move into a trajectory which is compatible with 1.5 degrees. As in this context, the EBRD has been promoting for many, many years a number of tools and approaches that try to bring together the different stakeholders. Is of course, the project developers, but also the financial institutions, including very much the local financial institutions, talking about what my friend Tony just mentioned, but also the technology providers and the policymaker and the regulators. I would like to give a couple of examples of this type of approaches and tools that we are planning to apply in this region as well. One is the work through local financial institutions, so credit lines that target SMEs, medium-sized enterprises for small-scale renewable energy and energy efficiency investments across all sectors, including, for example, agribusiness. And this is a 20 years program that we have. It's been very successful. We work with over 150 banks in the current EBRD region. And it's based on a number of tools. One is called Green Technology Selector, which is a web-based B2B platform where local technology providers can list their technologies on the basis of minimum performance criteria. And this allows the local project developers to choose and identify the solutions that can be applicable using local technology, locally available technologies, but with the minimum standards, which are designed and customized according to the specific country, but also allow the financial institution to facilitate the investment decision. So in a way, this allows reducing the transaction cost, improving the allocation of risk, and ultimately reducing the time that it takes to finalize an investment opportunity. Another example is the work we do in the green city space. We have a large program to cover over 60 cities across the BRD region. In Africa, we're doing work in Agadir, Alexandria, Cairo, and 6th of October City. And there the program is based on a tool which we call Green City Action Plan. It's a bottom-up tool that works with the inputs of local stakeholders at all levels, at the municipal level, at the level of the public, but also at the level of the local entrepreneurs and investors. And basically, is based on the development of a benchmarking analysis of the performance of the city according to a number of green and climate parameters. And the result of this work is basically 2 major tools, two major outputs. One is an investment plan based on discrete investments, and the second one is a policy roadmap that identify the bottlenecks that allow the investments to be scaled up. And this is also an interesting tool that can be linked to the capital market instruments. Just to finalize, all this work is really based on the fact that at EBRD we really believe that climate can be a major driver of, climate investments can be a major driver of development. Over 50% of our investments are in the climate and green space. And so the role of these tools for mobilization is really critical to scale up finance. Thank you.
Thank you. Moving now to the scientists in the conversation, Dr. Apollinaire Dicheking, Director General of the International Livestock and Research Institute, which is part of CGIAR. Professor, as Director General of ILRI, and you are the first African to hold this position, along with your other position as CGIAR Senior Director of Livestock-Based Systems, can you tell us about ongoing research and innovation efforts at your institution and in the CGIAR system that are focused on creating innovations and evidence that are required to support climate financing?
Thank you so much, Usma. Good afternoon, everyone. Greetings from the CGIAR and the International Livestock Research Institute. And just to echo what President Ruto said in the morning, welcome to the future. We're here to design the future that we want to leave ourselves and leave to our children and generations to come. So the CGIAR is more than 50 years old. It's a group of organizations set up to really address food security challenges. We're located across the world from the Americas, Africa, and also Asia. Our mission is really focused on the transformation of the land, aquatic, and food systems. And we do that reinforcing the notion that research and innovation should be the main driver. So Anthony, local science, there is no such thing as local science. I think it's local context. You have to do your research considering what is really happening at the local level. And we do our work through true partnerships with universities and institutions in the global south and also in the global north. We can count a number of innovations and technologies that we can claim to have achieved. In the country where we are sitting, more than 30 years ago, we worked with the Kenya Agricultural and Livestock Research Organization to establish what is continuously being used as the vaccine for East Coast fever. East Coast fever is the malaria parasite of bovine. It kills many thousands and millions of animals per year. The losses are considerable. We have demonstrated that using that innovation, we can actually avert to keep healthy animals. The second innovation that I can talk about at the CGR level is really new varieties of wheat and maize, potatoes that you can find across the world, feeding people. I wouldn't go on and on to tell you exactly everything we've done. I think just take it that the CGIAR as a system is really setting itself up to respond to the needs that we have and the crisis that we are facing. How do we do that? We do that focusing our work in three different domains. One is really the resilient agri-food systems. What we are talking about here, resilience, adaptation, and all that. We are pivoting our work to ensure that we are building the knowledge and the technologies to provide means for resilience. The second area of our work is really around genetic innovations. We are really fortunate to be the generation now to have the tools and the knowledge that we have. We can release new varieties of wheat, of any crops, and also including animals that will survive in different environments. That's really called genetic innovation. And that's an area where we really focus our work. The third area of work is really around system transformation. We have to understand what are the levers, the policy, the operating environment, the funding, the investment, reorganization of institutions to ensure that we have a real ecosystem for innovation and a real ecosystem for our innovation to actually be taken up. Because you can do excellent work. If you're not connected in the right way, your innovations will end up in your hands. So the International Livestock Research Institute is located here in Nairobi. For those who have the time to visit, please come and visit. We have so many things that we can claim in terms of innovation that we have generated. How do we demonstrate the importance of livestock into this? I don't have to bore you with the numbers. Any African family or in the global south that you've visited, there is always an animal somewhere. There is a chicken, there is a goat. How do we make those animals feed people? How do we make them contribute to socio-economic development? Our work is looking at that. When you also look at livestock in the global south, where is the livestock being developed? We have three main production systems. We have the mixed crops livestock system that you'll see in small families that you visit. How can we integrate livestock development in families where you have wheat, you have maize, you have sweet potato, to create what we call circular economy? I think this is where we're going to generate the knowledge. The second system is really the semi-intensive system. And this is an example where we are in this country. When you visit the outskirts of Nairobi, you'll see the dairy farms and things like that. This is where we want some of our solutions to be addressing challenges faced by those systems. The third one, which is always very neglected, is really the pastoral system. As we speak, more than 70% of the total animal population in this country is in the pastoral system. And this is where we have the degradation and things like that. We believe that our work should also focus there so that we can restore the ecosystems. We can deliver the breeds that will survive in those production systems. As we speak, the numbers are that the current drought that thankfully we just got out of, through that we lost more than 2.5 million head of animals. What type of animals can we produce to provide means for resilience in those production systems? Sorry to have gone too long, but it's really my excitement as a scientist to demonstrate that we must build a research and innovation agenda to support what we're talking here. We need to build on evidence. We don't have the time to just guess that, let's try this. We don't have the time to do it. But the precision that the research and innovation can bring can help us to make the right decision and make decision fast. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Doctor. Just conscious of time because we were told they wanted to keep things very strict. So, but I will move on. Antha Williams, the Director of Environment Programs at Bloomberg Philanthropies. We are absolutely thrilled to have you here today, not least because Bloomberg Philanthropies, global leadership on climate finance, but all the other areas of work that you've been doing in climate finance as well. So my question to you is, how can philanthropy support the creation of evidence-informed policy and the mobilization of climate finance in low and middle income countries?
Thank you so much, Uzma, and thank you to you and George and Community Jameel for putting this together, and to Laurence for your excellent opening comments, and the rest of the panelists here. Really a lot to think about and work on. To be quick, I think evidence-based policy is really crucial for decision makers, and I think when we look at the possibilities in countries across Africa, it's one of the things that is really inspiring to us. I mean, in addition to the comments that have already been made here in terms of the incredible optimism and natural resources, in terms of 60% of the world's solar potential being here, the incredible youth and vibrancy of growing populations and economies. There's a lot to move forward the ambitious policy agenda in countries across Africa. But as has been said, there's no time to waste. We need to focus our interventions on the things that are going to provide the biggest benefit, both in terms of climate, but also in terms of providing for people's livelihoods. And so having the evidence base about the growing industries, the jobs potential, the health benefits, in addition to climate benefits, is really critical and something where we see a very important role for philanthropy. I think the other places where philanthropy can play in a really important role is in convening the right sectors across society. The notion of combining the bottom-up demand for moves in the right direction from all of society with partnerships and assistance for governments to move in this direction is really the important pairing. And philanthropy sits at a really good place to be able to support the kind of people who are spending time on that from both ends, the top down and the bottom up ends. I think the other thing that Bloomberg always thinks about in terms of our philanthropy is that, our founder is an entrepreneur, a businessman, Mike Bloomberg and also the 3-term mayor of New York City. And so the idea that we need to work with businesses, with cities, and also that moves to address climate change and cut emissions are going to benefit society. They're going to create a roadmap for the investable future that's good for business and that's good for all of us. And so those are the places where we think philanthropy can play the biggest role. And we think, the participation in this kind of summit is just an incredible step in the right direction. So we're really excited about the work that we're doing, providing grants newly to a number of African countries, and including Kenya, and really excited about the possibility for all the work here. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Anta. Moving to Teresa Cadwallader. So Teresa is the Associate Director of Policy at the Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab, JPAL Africa. And as George hinted earlier, we understand that you'll be making an announcement. But first, and may I request to keep it at 2 minutes, because we want to give His Excellency Dr. Mahmoud time to give closing remarks. So the issues around a just transition to clean energy are critical, especially in countries like South Africa, where JPAL Africa is based. Can you give an example of how JPAL Africa is working in South Africa to help develop evidence-informed policies to ensure a just transition?
Thank you so much, and good afternoon, everyone. Please feel free to cut me if I go too long. I'll do my best. So in recent years, as many of you might know, South Africa's electrical grid has faced many infrastructural challenges, which has led to frequent load shedding, sometimes with up to 12 hours of cut service in a day. And so providing a reliable access to electricity will be a key component for a just energy transition in South Africa. At JPAL Africa, we conduct randomized evaluations, we build partnerships for evidence-informed policymaking, and we support our partners to scale up effective programs. One of JPAL Africa's flagship partnerships is with the City of Cape Town, with whom we have worked for the past decade to co-generate evidence on some of the city's key priorities, which, just to give you an example here, so this could be the use of prepaid electricity meters, behaviors around water conservation, and how best to leverage administrative data for decision making. And so with this, I am very excited to announce that we are expanding this work with Community Jameel as our funding partner. We are creating an embedded climate lab at the City of Cape Town. Our primary objective with this lab will be to, one, co-identify and generate actionable research on pressing policy questions related to accessing clean water and energy and reliable, clean water, clean air and reliable energy in Cape Town. Secondly, the hopes of this lab is that we will work through it to support not only the City of Cape Town, but also partners beyond, to integrate the lessons that we generate into action and policy. And lastly, we will keep working with the City of Cape Town to help them to leverage administrative data for both research and policy. And I think I'll close it very quickly to say that we are very much committed to sharing our findings with other climate actors, and we would love to learn more about what everyone's doing. So please feel free to come to me or my colleague Margaret, who is there in the audience, to speak to us afterwards.
Thank you, Teresa, and thank you for keeping to time. Community Jameel is humbled to be associated with the Jameel Observatory for Food Security Early Action, which George mentioned in his speech, and is based at ILRI here in Nairobi. And so turning to Dr. Guyo Malicha Roba, who's the head of the Jameel Observatory for Food Security Early Action. In your role as head of the center, how can climate finance for capacity building strengthen the resilience of the most vulnerable to climate change and food shocks? And I'm sorry, Dr. Guyo, but please do keep it to 2 minutes if possible. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think it's a very important question. In the observatory, the kind of research we do is action research, which means that it's a research with potential contribution to a real world problem. So, and that's why capacity element is very essential. When we started our research work like 1 year ago, this demand from the government to real demand to ask for support, to provide expertise, to analyze risk, to visualize risk, to communicate risk, and etc. in the food security space. And I think this is happening both in Kenya and Somalia at different level of institutional architecture. And this is very essential as we consider expanding our work and advancing our research. There are different levels in which capacity element features closely, and we took cognizance of that. One is where we are looking at early research, PhD, postdoc entry to build the pool of expertise within the African context. And the second, of course, is also having conversation with local universities to have a tailored, course research that will going to go and advance the training quality to align with the risks that we always see in the dryland space where we work. And lastly, of course, is the capacity of the communities to understand the revisualize risk and also respond to risk, which is a big issue, I think, which was mentioned by my colleague in terms of, the traditional early warning and the modern, what you call contemporary early warning, is not really sitting together. So element of building that trust entails, capacity element and aligning financing to this sort of capacity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gu. And I'm so sorry we don't have time for Q&A, but I'd like to ask His Excellency Dr. Mahmoud Mohieldin to take the stage, please, and provide closing remarks. Thank you, Your Excellency.
Right. Thank you so much. It's a great honor to address you briefly. Sorry that I missed the opportunity to share some introductory remarks. But I'm very sure that with Her Excellency Professor Tubiana and others sharing the introductory remarks who are covered on substance and inspiration. So my colleague told me that I'm going to share some reflections. So I told him, young man, I cannot really share reflections on a session that I only attended the part of it. But that reminded me of a colleague in one institution when we were discussing a report on Knowledge Bank with the Multilateral Development Banks as Knowledge Bank. That was like 9 years ago. It was like 400 pages. And he came late to the session and he didn't even read the report. And he said, well, I didn't read the report. However, I have some comments to make. So, and he was brave enough to inspire us, but I cannot match his talent and skills on that. But I come with few issues based on one of the creators on the labs, a contributor to fighting poverty, and now she has great deal of work on climate action, linking it to sustainable development goals and fighting poverty, especially extreme poverty in Africa and beyond, which is Professor Esther Duflo. And that was on the building up of COP27. And we asked her what could be the most critical issue that we need to consider. And she didn't really let us down by giving us 3 areas of focus that I think, at least in the few minutes I listened to, have been captured one way or another. One is about finance, the second is about technology, and the third is about the incentive structure. And each one of these areas require data systems, information, and knowledge sharing. In order to have adequate finance, you definitely need some support on the data on what works and what does not, how to avoid overlap, how to maximize impact. On areas related to science and technology, again, it's based on evidence and based on experimental and scientific solutions. And the third, people say, well, regulatory structure, frameworks for policymakers. Actually, this is exactly in need for more information, research and development to share experience from around the world. Some of the best examples, and actually we're just in the carbon market discussion today, are with those who benefited from other countries' experience, not to reinvent wheels, and push hard with the right partnerships based on data and adequate information. So I have few suggestions for you for areas that we really need some work on, and I'm happy that many of you in the room, including Excellency Professor Tubiana, on the leadership. First, on the climate and development finance. In the carefully prepared notes for me, I see them overwhelming everybody with numbers, but I have doubts with the aggregated data at the global level, because there is very little that we have from the local level in which you can really go through a bottom-up approach, including the good work on the cities, for instance, that was mentioned by Bloomberg. We need more of that. It's not just the top-down, it's not just the bottom-up, but basically in a more collaborative manner, we need to know the requirements for climate finance, and there is important work that started with COP27, continuing now with COP28 and COP27 on climate and development finance with Professor Nick Stern, Vera Songwe, and Amar Bhattacharya, and great group of experts trying to provide some solutions on gaps, and more importantly, how to solve them. If you are seeking more controversial topic, please welcome to the new world of ESG. It's full of science, controversy. You need the best lawyers if you are in the United States. You need the most substantive teams for hard work. And if you have ideas, seeing colleagues from UNFCCC with me here who are tasked to operationalize the recommendation of the high-level experts group, Minister McKenna. And if you have ideas, please share them immediately, please, with the Executive Secretary of the UN, of the UNFCCC. Again, here the problems are there. What we don't need really is to add more challenges. And again, please try to challenge the old way. When I was in government as a minister asking for help, I would get a report, 85% about problems that I'm more familiar with, and 15% of generic wisdom that it needs to be tailored for the country needs. I'm self-critical. I still work with these MDBs and IFIs, so it's not really criticizing fellows from a distance. It's self-criticism, I hope constructively. Then on carbon market, and we just finished the work on ACME and the pillars, but it needs definitely more support on guidance from science and researchers. If you are finished with that, you can help us with this kind of important work related to adaptation. The main challenge for Africa is not just about emissions, because everybody, including His Excellency the President of Kenya today, said, well, when it comes to emissions, go elsewhere, because we are very low in emissions. But we are among the top sufferers from the consequences. A simple challenge: why the private sector, including actually to a great extent philanthropies, are still shying away from climate finance when it comes to adaptation. Now we have the Sharm el-Sheikh adaptation agenda of 5 specific areas of work, seeking finance technology to support planning in areas related to water management, food system, agricultural development, settlements, defending the coastal areas and beyond. Can you provide guidance to the private sector eager to engage on this, but perhaps the perception of risk is complicating their work? If you are finished with this task, you can help a big thing, because there is, I would say, and they are all friends, that Professor Stern, my sister Vera, and Amar have great deal of emphasis on domestic resource mobilization. It will not just come from external finance, private or public. It will come from domestic resource mobilization, and here the figures are of trillions of what could be mobilized. A simple question: why until this very moment, since the great global achievement of having the Paris Agreement, and we have again the leader of the Friends of Paris with us in the room, why we don't really have a budget-based SDGs, a budget-based climate action, and we think of budget as a kind of an afterthought? What could be the kind of work on that? If you are finished with this task, I have 2 more and I'll finish. One is related to the ongoing work on the just energy transition partnerships. Why it is progressing in some countries slowly and is basically stumbling in others. Why we're not really seeing adequate effort in the decarbonization of the hard-to-abate sector? What can we do more in order to convince the G7 and beyond to engage further in this area? And then I have a final challenge with solutions. We can always talk about knowledge, scientific research, but without basic investment in data systems, your work will be very much compromised. In what way we can really improve the data systems, tailoring them for decision making, not just for government, but for the private sector and philanthropy to do a better job going forward. Having said that, I'm looking forward to the outcomes of your collaboration, and without science, research, and the great minds behind it, from university networks to think tanks and research centers, our work will not be finished. But I'm more optimistic that we're realizing the importance of bridging these gaps and looking forward to the outcomes of your great work collectively. Thank you so much.